So it's been a great day. This is our last panel. Then we'll have a few closing remarks, and then we'll adjourn. So on this panel, the panel will be moderated by Daniel Sasser, who's a fellow at the Information Law Institute here at NYU.
Hi, everyone. So we've made it to the last panel of the day. Your perseverance will no doubt be rewarded by the insights of our panelists. To schematize things a little bit, we heard in the first afternoon panel from some people who need data. We heard in the second panel about some people who have data and may or may not be able to share it. And so our hope for this facilitating connections panel is to start to maybe bridge that gap a little bit. As Joris said, I'm Daniel Sasser. I'm a research fellow here at the Information Law Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce Stefaan Verhulst from NYU's GovLab, Julie Cohen from the Georgetown University Law Center, Craig Konnoth from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Rebecca Rosen from NYU's Center for Urban Science and Progress.
Thank you very much, and thank you for still being here. I mean, I'm quite impressed on a Friday afternoon that we actually have still an audience. I had anticipated a dialogue among the panelists, but it's, I'm delighted to be here, especially given the fact that about a year ago, I wrote a blog which was about the next generation of open data, i.e. open corporate data. And at that time, there was actually a very limited debate about how can we start opening up corporate data. And I'm delighted the last panel and this panel actually to see that there is a lot of traction and a lot of new insights being generated around open corporate data. I mean, at GovLab, we do a lot of work around open data, and so this is just an overview of a taxonomy that we recently developed in the context of 19 detailed case studies about the impact of open data. And what the taxonomy indicates is that there are a variety of value propositions behind open data, ranging from solving problems, improving government, empowering users, to ultimately creating economic opportunity. And the important element that we started also working on is that the same value propositions, i.e. to improve the way we make decisions, improve the way we solve public problems, whether these are health problems or whether these are problems with regard to transport, the way we improve the way users make decisions or citizens make decisions, and the way we can create economic opportunity, especially among those that might be economic underserved. Those same value propositions are associated with actually open corporate data, given the fact that there is a lot of data being collected within corporations and throughout the use of corporations. The question thus is, how can we start having access to the data that might actually provide value in the way that I just tried to explain without going too much into detail. And that's an element that we've started working on at GovLab in a variety of ways. One way is where we started documenting examples actually of early efforts where corporations start sharing the data for public good. And so we call that data collaboration, which we, by the way, believe is a new concept that is needed in order to reflect on how corporations can start exchanging data with the public in order to exchange value. And so it's not a traditional kind of public-private partnership. It's really a new kind of collaboration with society and with public actors in order to create public value. And so with the Data Collaboratives Directory, we started documenting examples of actually corporate data sharing for public good. That led also to a conference last year that we organized together with OSTP and with several other US government agencies, which was called Accelerating Data Collaboratives, which really focused on how can you actually start sharing corporate data for public good and what is the right policy framework, if at all. And lately, we also teamed up with the University of Leiden and with the World Economic Forum to develop something called a data governance project that really specifically focuses on how can you start accelerating the use and the sharing of corporate data for public good, especially in this case in the development area, in the area where humanitarian aid is being provided or conflicts are being tried to be prevented. And this ultimately leads us to the conclusion that when we talk about open data for corporations, that we have to start thinking about shades of openness. I mean, traditionally, open data, of course, is defined, as we've heard through the literature review this morning, in a manner that really has a high standard, i.e. that where it's publicly available data that can be universally and readily accessed, used, and redistributed free of charge, that is released in ways that protect private, personal, or proprietary information, and that is structured for usability and computability. So basically, open data definition traditionally is about making data accessible, trustworthy, and computable. And if we go in the realm of open corporate data, we actually have to start thinking about this as a high standard, but that there might be other ways to actually share data that not automatically meet that standard. And so that's the reason why we call it shades of openness, where you actually have a variety of ways to start sharing data that might be open in a certain way. And so through our work, we actually started developing a taxonomy of sharing corporate data, that we have to become more smarter about the range of openness that can be used or is limited with regard to sharing corporate data. And so here we have identified around 6 buckets, and of course everyone who has developed a taxonomy knows that a taxonomy never is perfect, but there are about 6 buckets in which we have identified ways of sharing data by corporations for the public good. One way is, of course, which has been discussed, and I'm going to briefly discuss them and then reflect on how to do this in a more systemic manner by adopting a data governance framework. But one, and probably one that is most well known, is the traditional academic research partnerships. And so, for instance, Yelp has a way to share some of its data with academics through its Yelp academic data set, where they specifically target the academic community to develop answers to questions by using Yelp's data set. Another example is the Digital Ecologies Research Partnership, where several social media platforms are sharing, again, data with academics in order to become smarter about actually how online activities take place, how ultimately life in an online environment evolves. And so this is a kind of corporate data sharing where clearly you have access to data sets that are owned or collected by, is a whole different term, collected by corporations and shared for public good objectives, in this case research objectives. And other kind of sharing that we have seen accelerating and have seen growing the last few years is through prizes and challenges, where corporations are making their data sets available, and then there is a challenge in which they can win a prize, whoever tries to use the data set and starts answering questions. And so there are a variety of prizes and challenges right now. For instance, Telecom Italia has a big data challenge every year. The next one is coming up in 2016, where they ultimately release some data called detailed records, and then we have then teams working on the data to come out with a variety of insights that otherwise would probably not be feasible. We have the challenge D4D, which was organized by Orange, where again data was, oh my gosh, data was, they are brutal here in time. Data was shared for development purposes in Senegal, for instance. And then lately, of course, we have Global Pulse starting to develop the data for climate action, where you have corporations signing up to share data to then start becoming smarter about climate mitigation, especially in Africa. A third element, and I'm going to speed up, a third way to share data that we have seen by corporations is through the trusted intermediary kind of model, where you have an intermediary that is trusted by the corporation that can handle requests for having access to the data. And so here, for instance, an example is real impact analytics that is seen by some telecom operators as a trusted intermediary to mitigate requests to have access to their data. A other, of course, and that's then the far end quite often of sharing is, of course, through just an API, which is, of course, where quite often many researchers would see as the nirvana of actually having access to corporate data. And so in this case, of course, many of you know the bit.ly data API, which again has changed over time and has become less open than it was before, but it's a kind of data sharing, again, that enables having access to corporate data, in this case, bit.ly data, that can extract some insights. And lastly, what we see as well is the growth of something called data cooperatives or data pooling, where you actually have corporations contributing data to a pool, and then you can have access to the pool in a manner that generates data. One that has just started is the Data Futures Partnership, a very interesting new way of actually starting to exchange public and private data in New Zealand. And then another one is, for instance, the old trials one, where you have actually pharmaceuticals starting to contribute the trials data to a common platform in which you then can access the data. Lastly, I forgot, what you also have, of course, which is at the far end, is a kind of data sharing where you only provide access to the intelligence, the algorithmic insights of using the data. The MasterCard example is actually an example of that kind of sharing. Google Flu was such an example. Right now, of course, it doesn't exist anymore, but where you ultimately had insights being generated, and then the insights were shared as opposed to the raw data were shared. We have, of course, the JP Morgan Institute, which is interesting, a new kind of institute, new kind of think tank, only around data, right? And so where the institute generates insights by actually generating or applying algorithms to the data that they have. So the question is, how can we do this? How can we accelerate this? And how can we do it in a responsible manner? And so what we really need to think about as a, especially academic community, but also those who are practitioners in the field, is we really need to start thinking about a new paradigm of data governance. And the new paradigm of data governance that focuses on 4 key elements that needs to be developed in parallel and needs to be in place in order to strengthen the trustworthiness of actually that sharing. And so the 4 areas that we at GovLab with the Data Governance Project are starting to look at are areas in which you, A, develop propositions, and that needs to be done in a new, quite often, fashion, because the existing way of developing propositions is very limited. And here I mean propositions so that before you start sharing the data, that you actually have an insight of what's the value that you ultimately seek to create. Because it turns out that there is a correlation, and that, by the way, is an academic research where far more insight needs to be generated, is that to what extent is there a higher risk of privacy or data disclosure if there is no clear sense about the benefit and the question you seek to address, versus if there is a sense of actually the problem statement that you seek to address and the value you seek to generate. Will this actually lead to more responsible use and responsible selection of the data, which also means what I've been calling for many years, the need for a skill set, which is the information audit skill set, where you actually start identifying what is the data I need, the minimum data set I need in order to start addressing the question, as opposed to give me all the data and then ultimately I will generate some insight. And so that's a skill set that needs to be developed and that should be part of a data governance environment. Same thing for risk. I mean, there are a variety of efforts, and Ira Rubenstein has written about that, more prolific, set a whole area of Now they're going to start throwing things at me. So a whole area of, yeah, Helen already has a bottle yeah, a whole area of experiments on how you start auditing the data for risks. And so we need to actually develop that skill set. We need to develop that practice more than we've done before, which also ultimately leads to this understanding of what's the proposition behind the use of the data and the sharing of the data from a value generation and from a risk generation. Principles, I'm going to go quickly, is that the existing principles of fair information practices, and we all know that, are still in use, surprise, surprise, 30 years after their creation, but I haven't seen yet a revamp that actually is satisfactory. And so this remains a task, especially if we start merging that with more and more demands for data ethics. So how do we get a new set of principles that guide the responsible use of data that builds upon the FIPS and includes the data ethical demands that are typical to a big data environment. Practices, we need new practices. This morning there was already a discussion about frameworks for contracts. We need new kinds of contracts that are agile and can be made context specific, but that can steer the environment. We need new decision flows to actually make and automate some kind of responsible use. And we need ultimately also different kind of technologies. Processes here, and now I need to stop. So processes, it is important to realize, I mean, there's a whole debate about is data a property versus data a process. And I always emphasize that, especially in a big data environment, data is a process. It's a flow where the different decisions are made in the creation of value. And we need to also develop a governance framework that allows for this flow to be included, so that we don't have ultimately a one decision around one stage that doesn't inform and may impact the other one. And lastly, given the fact that the objective is to serve the public, then obviously we need to find ways to bring the public in the data governance environment. And so we need to come up with processes, with governance processes that are seen as legitimate and credible, and that's the process element that ultimately brings the circle, brings the circle of data governance around developing a proposition, developing principles, innovate in practice, and especially approach it from a process perspective. And I apologize for the rush. I think Helen is to blame, and I think Julie is next. Thank you very much.
All right. Oh, crap. I use a Mac, so this is now going to devolve. You got it? Okay, right there. Okay, I'm much shorter than Stefaan, so if we did the little Sesame Street game, one of these things is not like the others, that would probably be the presentation you're about to hear in the context of a conference on open data, but they invited me, so I'll have to assume that they knew what they were doing. So I'm going to draw out for you some of the what I see as the relatively dystopian implications of open data as the default condition for a lot of things that happen in our society. It relates to data appropriation and aggregation, and the overall thrust of what you're about to hear is that I think the framework we've been using to have the discussion about data appropriation and aggregation, which is predominantly informed by privacy and data protection, actually isn't the one we want to be using if we want to understand it. The one we want to be using is a frame of resource appropriation. So what does that mean? So the project I'm currently involved in involves flipping some of the questions that legal scholars and lawyers typically ask about new technological developments, and they're these, right? How does the ongoing evolution of the networked information environment affect our existing laws and freedoms, and what should law do about it? How should the law respond? Flipping the questions means asking these questions. How are disputes about information and networked architectures actually reshaping the law itself? Okay, the legal system that we have is to a very large extent an artifact of an industrial political economy. A lot of the things we take for granted, ranging from like the forms of tort and contract law to the structure of our administrative state, are industrial artifacts. And they didn't spring into being by magic. They're the result of self-interested actions and political settlements reached by powerful actors. So the other flipped question is, how are powerful actors in the networked information environment mobilizing law to their advantage to reinforce certain changes and foreclose or limit others? What's the paradigm shift? It's the shift from industrial to informational capitalism, and so now to resource appropriation. It's tempting, and you hear it a lot, to talk about technology as being the driver of a transformation, but transformations in political economy also require resources. Industrial capitalism required land, labor, and money. That's Polanyi, that's kind of the standard. Informational capitalism requires content, information, code, your attention, and as I'm about to explain to you, it requires all of us to be the raw materials. Now, critically, newly valuable resources engender new appropriation strategies. They have to be invented. They have to be created by lawyers acting and by entities acting opportunistically and lawyers helping them. And law itself is one of the moving parts. So legal institutional strategies are resource appropriation strategies. And now I want to draw your attention to a particular construct from property and intellectual property world that is being deployed as an appropriation strategy for personal data, but also at the same time being changed and adapted to become an operational construct for the era of informational capitalism. And that is this thing that I am calling the biopolitical public domain. Biopolitical because, as we're about to see, it pertains to the measurement, management, and control and processing of populations. And it consists of two interlinked strategies. A public domain is also not a naturally occurring thing. A public domain is an idea, right? An idea of lands available to be taken, even though, like, Native Americans might be living on them, right? Or an idea of ideas available to be put to application and then the results patented. So here's the biopolitical public domain. Here's strategy number one of the two. It's a resource-related strategy, and it consists of socio-technical reorganization for data cultivation and harvesting. In other words, it consists not simply in appropriating the result of a natural reality that is already there, but actually reorganizing activity to produce more and more of the resource that is valuable. And a couple different ways this happens, but here are two really important ones. One, and it's the one that is principally applicable in developed nations and among the more economically fortunate populations, is data flows from the sensing net. The mobile devices that some of you are checking right now, right? The Internet of Things, the Fitbits, the wearable computing, all of those things actually have been built and are being built, and the apps that they carry are designed to constitute data flows and make them available for harvesting. In the developing world, it's a little different. What we see in the developing world and in more marginalized populations in the developed world also is data flows initially for policing and development, right? So the tracking of felons and arrestees and welfare recipients, and the tracking of educational data and health data, the MasterCard initiatives to extend financial accounts to people in developing countries via mobile devices. And I think those initiatives have a lot of great aspects, so I don't want to bash them, but they become a source of data flows. And the UN folks that deal with development are totally unused to privacy and data protection framings. They think all these flows of data are just grand. Those data flows come and encounter a strategy that privacy academics have bewailed, which is the widespread use of contractual frameworks to kind of enclose this data and bring it in and make it secret. But that, of course, is a time-honored intellectual property strategy. That's how you draft contracts in IP world, to assert control over otherwise uncopyrightable information, for example, and to make it the subject of ownership so that you can make it the vehicle for profit-making strategies. So this is so after all of this socio-technical reorganization, you need also kind of an institutional strategy, and that is a process by which we are all brought to understand that whatever interests might have existed in the raw material becomes subordinated to the privilege claims of data harvesters. And this is old stuff in property and intellectual property law. This is John Moore's suit against the University of California Medical Center, which took his spleen and harvested the cells and learned that his T cells, I think, or antibodies or something, were really valuable in cancer research, but didn't tell him, and got a bunch of patents. And he sues, and to property professors, sometimes they say that stands for anti-commodification of personal tissue because he loses. The court says you can't have a property right in your personal tissue. But one of the things that makes them want to say that is because that would too greatly muck up the downstream property rights, the patents enjoyed by the researchers who didn't tell him what they were going to do with his tissue. So the privilege claims vest downstream, and here the privilege claims vest downstream in, going to the bottom of the slide, the aggregators, right? The data scientists and the other folks who generate these proprietary or patented analytics. But that is kind of a legal fiction, right? It's a just so story that is told to make this whole process seem natural, and it passes over the creation and the sort of normalization of an industrial production cycle for data. That has, I'm actually doing really great on time, by the way, because I'm talking really fast. So the industrial production cycle for data has three main sort of prongs. One is the generation of what I call data cultivars, and I'm sort of cribbing from Michael Pollan here, right? The industrial food chain. The data aren't just laying around there. Again, what we do in our mobile computing environment is develop data cultivars. We design them to elicit types of data that are suitable, that are optimized for industrial scale harvesting and processing, and that reflects certain aspects of people's behaviors and transactions in which those eliciting the data are interested. The cultivars move into the refineries. The refineries refine the data into virtual representations suitable for again, industrial scale exploitation, by which I mean describing population aggregates. Think again of all the things that happen to industrial corn cultivars after they make their way into those factories, right? High fructose corn syrup and a million chemical extracts with 40-syllable names that are extracted because they too are optimized for industrial food production and for use as preservatives or what have you. And then phase 3, the data markets. The markets that are generated, again, by touting these patented analytics as the sort of recipients of these population aggregates, which are valued for their probabilistic attributes, for their use in structuring exchanges to extract consumer surplus from the very same folks who served as the raw materials in the first place, i.e. us. And so as this cycle continues, we all sort of become, even we the raw materials, party to the creation, to the construction of a legal fiction that starts to seem completely normal and appropriate. So let me bring it back to open data, right? So why am I even here? I worry that open data itself becomes kind of a discursive frame that helps to legitimize this process, right? In another paper I have called the Surveillance Innovation Complex, I talk about this a little more, but we are all sort of inculcated with the virtues of openness and sharing and of participation, right? And so we are very much participants in the construction of a process within which we are the raw materials. And if you are resisting everything I'm saying, good, because one purpose of this is just to make you really angry. What might we do? Borrow from the IP world, again, in strategies for constructing commons for beneficial uses of open data. And so that's some of the stuff that Stefaan talked about, so I won't have to. But there are some problems, and I'll just leave you with this final thought. The stuff of open data doesn't behave like fisheries or grazing rights. It kind of floats around a lot, and it's difficult to constrain the downstream uses. And then if we figured all that out, we still have to worry about the neoliberal First Amendment, which is when the data processors come and say, you can't actually regulate us in a way that stops us from doing these things. So if people could figure out solutions to those problems, I would be really happy. And I'll sit down now.
So that's a really tough act to follow, and I think I may be the only person without a slide, but I have a notebook, and I don't know how to put my notebook on here. But can I put that down there? Thank you. So I'm really low tech because I'm not really a privacy person, but I'm a health law person, and I do write about health privacy work. And in some ways, what I'm talking about, to some extent, follows on from what Julie says, actually, because I think that what I'm trying to get at is a concept of open data that doesn't have the same pathologies that Julie has identified. What's really struck me in this conference so far is that when individuals have spoken about open data, they've always assumed that the data is the corporations to share, without really thinking about the sources of information from which the information came from, until Julie, I think, came up and spoke. So let me start out from where my paper starts, and I'll hopefully get to some point with respect to health, which I admit is a slightly different context, and we think about these issues in slightly different ways there. So as Kim Gray in the previous panel pointed out, the collection of health information does yield a whole range of benefits, but as we all know, it comes with various burdens and harms, which I won't go into with this audience. I do want to point out the size of this collection that's already happening, right? So by the time CMS finishes its meaningful use program, at least CMS will have access to the data of about 100 million Americans. That's 1 out of 3 Americans in the long run. We don't know when that program's going to finish, but that's what's expected. And this represents a fundamental shift from the way information collection has occurred in the health information sphere historically. Historically, it would be collection from specific individuals or groups in specialized contexts, such as during public health emergencies or during clinical trials. And now what we're getting to is this routine, universalized form of collection. There are certain problems with this collection, however. First, there are procedural problems. I don't think we are really discussing the values that underlie this collection and what it's supposed to achieve, as well as the distribution of privacy risks, right? So most of the individuals in these databases are individuals who are participants in public programs, right? Get public health insurance. And so you really see recipients of Medicare and Medicaid and Veterans Affairs. Those are the areas where a lot of the health privacy individuals focus on, and the privacy risks to those individuals seem to be the greatest. Those who receive private insurance or pay out of pocket are not subject to similar risks. So what this paper points out is that the universal routine collection of health information for the public good bears a great similarity to the universal routine collection of another resource for the public good, namely income tax. So, of course, right at the beginning, I want to say that income is not the same thing as tax, right? You can think about various differences between the resources in themselves. So you can use information again and again. For example, income, unfortunately, once spent is spent forever. And you can think about other similarities. But what I'm interested in pinpointing is the relationship between the individual and society with respect to that resource, and looking at how the ethical considerations affect that relationship. So first, I think that the demand society imposes with respect to both resources are somewhat limited in nature, right? So if you think, so both with respect to the collection of information and the collection of money, the demands are more limited than, for example, interventional trials or conscription. And I defend that a little bit more in the paper, why there is that distinction and why the burdens are imposed by information collection and tax collection are somewhat comparable. And further, both are meant to achieve the public good. Again, Kim Gray spoke about that in the last panel, and I won't go into that in any detail. But I think more interesting are the justifications that underlie both forms of collection. And I think Kirsten referred to this a little bit in the last panel. So first, in both contexts, if you look at the bioethics literature and if you look at the tax literature, what scholars have said is that you need to pay back to society the benefits you have obtained from society, the benefit principle. Second, you've got to help out individuals who are in a worse situation than you are. And third, this is a form of solidarity. You're engaging with your fellow comrades in society to make society go ahead as a whole. And therefore, you should provide your health information or provide your tax money for these purposes. And so I argue that there is a fundamental analogy between the two forms of collection in various ways, at least at an ethical level. Well, the question is, what's the payout of this analogy? I think first, you get values that in the tax context have been vetted over centuries, right? Why is it that individuals should pay tax, and what are the principles that should guide that taxation? Adam Smith laid out certain principles, and those have sort of continued to guide us through the years. The first principle here is this notion of equity, so that individuals who are similarly situated should be treated equally, and individuals who are situated, who are better off than others, should somehow be burdened more in that system than individuals who are worse off. In the health information context, I argue in some detail, which I won't go into here, that individuals who are in better health, the health is the determinant of how individuals are situated with respect to each other, and that individuals who are in better health are better off, at least with respect to the values that their health framework seeks to achieve, than individuals in worse health. And so to the extent you're going to try and you have to impose burdens or privacy risks upon individuals, you must calibrate risks based upon how individuals are situated with respect to each other. In other words, we should take steps to minimize as much as possible. We aren't going to minimize it completely, but minimize as much as possible the information burdens on those who are in worse health. So, for example, you can put into place remote monitoring technologies so that individuals who are in worse health who do need to be monitored do not have to suffer material burdens that come with the monitoring, such as having to go to the doctor's office. Or to the extent that you have studies that require only a certain number of individuals to achieve a certain level of confidence with respect to its outcomes, you can exclude those individuals who are in worse health and therefore exclude them from the privacy risks that come from them. I think more controversially, what happens is that individuals in public health programs have their data publicly available a lot of the time, but individuals, healthier individuals, individuals who are wealthier, often don't interact with the health system in similar ways. They often will participate in wellness programs through their employer or wear wearable medical technology and never actually go to see a provider. And so what I argue is that we need to extend the information collection apparatus to the extent we have it for individuals who are worse off. We should extend the apparatus to individuals who are better off and ensure that they are part of the same system that these other individuals are in as well. There remain difficult questions of how do we distribute the benefits of this collection, as well as questions of scope. At what level is a collection too much? And I think that that Smith's next point, the procedural principles of justice that apply, should give us guidance there. So in the procedural context, what we see in the tax system is that we vote for individuals. Those individuals lay out their platform, and we vote for them based on that platform, and then they try and enact those policies into law. And then we can sue if those policies are not followed by the agency. I'm great. I was so scared to begin with that I'm actually further than I need to be. So basically, what happens is that in the health information context, we seem to use informed consent, a private contract-based model to determine whether health information should be collected. But what we're beginning to see are broad forms of consent, participatory consent, as we see in other areas and as some people have spoken about today. But what I'm arguing for is a form of democratic consent, a recognition that the collection of information implicates the relationship of the individual to society as citizens of that society, and that they should engage in a democratic debate about the values inculcated, of the values implicated in the collection. It is not corporations that are the primary actors and entities here, it is the individual. And third, I refer to various efficiency considerations in the health context. There are problems with anti-competitiveness, a lack of coordination, when we're talking about the collection of data, the setting of research goals, and the distribution of the benefits of collection. And I argue that allowing a democratically elected government some level of centralized access to the information to set these research goals in appropriate ways would address many of these problems. I think in some ways, especially after Julie's talk, some of the benefits of the system are conceptual, right? And there are various policy-related conceptual benefits that I talk about to health audiences. But I think here, the conceptual benefits are, I think, the role of the individual, right? So when a corporation passes on your information to the government in the name of open data, what exactly is the individual who originally owned that data have to say about it? A lot of the time, very little. And so I think that this framework helps address that problem. It resituates the individual as the subject and owner of his or her data, and involves the individual in that conversation about how data should be passed on and how research goals should be set. I think it also helps set, thank you, it helps set an alternate. I think this better not count towards my time, but hecklers in the audience. But I also think it sets an alternate version of value, right? So instead of the vision of value that Julie is critiquing, where all you have is value that's the aggregate of individual companies' values in the consumer sphere, we're talking about a vision of value that's created through dialogue in the public sphere, through democratic processes. On the other hand, you may argue that government is already subject to the same pathologies that Julie has identified, in which case much of my framework may be subject to similar critiques, but I think that it is more salvageable than the capitalist framework which Julie lays out. And finally, is the tax analogy useful for this? Now, I think the tax analogy is useful because it lays out a system that's not specific, I think, to income, but really is a system of justice that describes the relationship between the individual and society, and also helps engage individuals in what most individuals would think of as fairly esoteric and specialized debates, right? I mean, what we're talking about here, we don't really talk about on the streets or when we go to bars unless we're with the same people. And what I'm hoping, people understand tax. Tax makes people upset, but they grudgingly accept its need and are willing to engage in the conversation. And I'm hoping that this analogy will bring individuals into the conversation so that what we will achieve is truly a public dialogue that helps move the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So the last speaker of the day. All right. Well, so I'm really happy to see the name of this session is Facilitating Connections, because it confirms our choice of calling what we're building at the Center for Urban Science and Progress. It's a data facility. And the goal of the data facility that we're building is to connect our community of practice. It's a very broad community. We're talking about city agencies, data providers, and researchers, a broad swath of researchers, computer scientists, social scientists, physicists, astrophysicists, everything in between, and also students and ultimately citizens. So how do we build a safe and secure data environment where all of these people can come and find high-value products, and then we can achieve the CUSP mission of developing new analyses and models for urban policy and operations? So I'll talk today about the mission of the CUSP Data Facility and our framework and our initial approach to building this in a way that's meant to be high value, but adheres to a type of data governance framework that Stefaan described. So our mission is to make this new and existing data available to researchers in a secure way, protecting confidentiality, and providing them with state-of-the-art tools. But our second goal is to engage the staff in government agencies and also to engage citizens to use this data facility. So we can't create just a research data center like the Census Research Data Center where the data sit behind lock and key, you send your code, and out comes some results. You have to be able to get in there, work, and collaborate. So we need to think about various components, both social and technical, to enable that kind of data facility. So we've worked with the communities I just described to develop this service model. There are 5 service pillars that we've identified as high value across all of these communities. You'll recognize it looks a little bit like the data lifecycle. We're talking about getting data in, curating it, and managing it responsibly, making that data discoverable and accessible, providing a space for collaboration and a place where researchers can reproduce one another's work. There's a large component of training and engagement, and also secure dissemination or not secure depending on the kind of data. And the red circles are describing the types of services that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So our approach, it's a framework. It's a framework to allow us to identify the highest value services in those pillars that we can develop as the core of a data facility where we can start getting all of those community members to start working together and demonstrate that this is a feasible approach. So we want to have safe people, we want safe projects, we want safe settings, and we want safe outputs. And we believe that that framework will give us a safe data environment for urban policy research. So this is not brand new work. We're building on many of these existing infrastructures. We're doing it in a slightly different way because we're flipping it into a service model. Many of these have services for individual communities. We have many more, so it's a little more complex. There are a lot of them. So safe people. What we're doing now to encourage safe people is training. So we're leveraging existing training modules for privacy and confidentiality. We also have in-house on-site training for all of the new students who are coming to CUSP. We record them and we save them on the website so that all new people can come and look at them before they have access to our data. We are classifying our data. And this goes back to how Stefaan was describing. Not all data is open, but we have green, yellow, and red. And this is a very simple way of describing to users what type of data they're using when they're working with it. We can use this color code throughout the data facility to remind people to be responsible with the data. And I won't read what is in there, but you can imagine what green, yellow, and red. Green is public, yellow is restricted, and red is confidential. So safe projects. So one thing I think is very important is to emphasize the project over the data. We're emphasizing that researchers think about the questions and they think about the approach and the methods and then why they need that specific data set to do that research. And I see Stefaan nodding, we've had this conversation before. So rather than providing a laundry list of data sets to new CUSP users, we ask that they tell us what their research question is and help them to identify what data sets are most appropriate. And you'll see on this screen, this is our CUSP data hub. And you can see on the right side, these are the color coding. And this is something that we're drawing throughout as people start using the data facility. And the services that we provide, the way in which we provide those services depend on the type of data with which you're doing research. So if you start exploring the CUSP data catalog and you identify data sets that are not openly accessible, these are yellow data sets, for example. If you want to use that data set for research, you have to submit a research proposal. So what's your research question, what's your proposed methodology, and what are your expected outcomes? And then what data sets or databases do you want to use and why? And then we have a review process. And we believe that this is a way of encouraging safe projects and safe people and responsible use of the data sets that are being provided by our city agency partners. The safe setting. So this is a technical component. We need to provide a safe server environment where those data live and can be accessed responsibly. If they're yellow and red data, they're only accessible through a remote server, a remote desktop. Green data can be accessed more easily. And so we have a variety of ways in which users can interact with the data, and we describe that through the data hub, and it's color-coded, so it's very easy to understand. That communication layer we're finding is very effective for engaging users and keeping them coming back. So this is just what you see. This is the remote desktop. And then we have another tool in the bottom right, and it's a way of users interacting with this green data from a web interface. So safe outputs. We want to focus, it's not just about data access and data use, it's about data dissemination. How do you get the data out so you can share it with your colleagues and share it with the broader public and city agencies? Green data, there are no protections for data export. But yellow and red data, we've heard a lot today about various statistical disclosure approaches. We are doing that as well. It's really hard with some of the types of data we're working with. This is a research question, and we are researching inside CUSP to figure out new approaches to disclosure limitation for complex and unique new data sets. We have instituted a process, and it's, again, about communicating, telling our users, how do you prepare data for statistical disclosure review? Most of the researchers at CUSP are not familiar with the Census Research Data Center rules, so we provided an easy-to-use data export policy that describes how, wow, I'm way ahead. We have a data export policy that describes to users how to annotate data from the beginning of their research workflow and then provide that information in an easy-to-use data set for our reviewer to determine whether or not all the entities have been de-identified. We also have then an export request form that they can fill out on the website. So, wow, that was really short. So where are we going from here? Well, first we want to assess, have we built the correct core of the data facility platform? Are people using it? Do we have the researchers coming in? Are they actually generating research and able to collaborate and able to pull out the results and use them effectively? Are the city agencies continuing to trust us and give us their data? Are the students using this facility and sharing it with their colleagues? So where we're going from here, if this is indeed the right place, we want to look towards building smart research data centers. So Amazon does this, iTunes does this. We have recommendation engines. We know you put in a research description, you should know what data sets are appropriate for your research. You shouldn't have to go searching through a catalog of 2,000 data sets. So we really hope to be able to build those kinds of recommendation engines in our data facility. User dashboards that allow you to collaborate and track the progress of your own projects. Separate green and yellow-red workspaces. Right now it's all in one place, and you know where you are by the data set you're working with, so we want to separate that out technically. And also, the challenge in urban science is managing new kinds of data sets, and so this is an ongoing research question that the CUSP researchers are analyzing. How do you manage all the sensor data coming in, and how do you appropriately protect it and protect its export? And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So if you have questions, please go ahead and line up behind the microphone in the middle. While we have some time, we'll take them one at a time. If we have a lot of questions and the time starts to run out, we'll start to take multiple questions at once. So Jos?
Thank you. So again, Jos Berends, Leiden University's Center for Innovation. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious, so about a month ago in The Hague, we started the International Data Responsibility Group, and that's with our partners at Datapop, it's GovLab, it's UN Global Pulse Initiative, Data and Society, and together we've decided to start looking at especially the risks around using data of very vulnerable populations in crisis-affected areas. I'm wondering, as you describe these governance mechanisms, what happens to them if there is suddenly this very acute need for data and the balance, suddenly the benefits greatly outweigh the risks? Do all reds become green? Do new connections exist? What changes?
Should I respond?
Sure, maybe Stefaan.
Well, of course I know Jos,
Yeah.
so we have conversations all day long, so you should.
I need to think about that. So what happens when there's an acute need for data? I think it's a question for the experts. I think it's just something, one thing that we're doing is creating review committees for all of these processes. So when somebody submits a research project request, it's not just one person saying, check, that looks right. We have to engage the right stakeholders to come together and review. And so I would say the only approach is to pull together the appropriate review committee.
I think the question, I agree with that. I think the question emphasizes, which I forgot to emphasize in my presentation, is the importance of urgency and time quite often, especially around sharing corporate data sets, because many of the examples that we see right now are actually examples where corporations are being called upon to share data sets, especially in conflict zones during times of crisis. And so, which basically means that they have then, suddenly the data sets are released, data is being used in order to save lives, because that's of course then the rationale and the value proposition. And then what do you do with it once, of course, lives are saved and Ebola is not a crisis anymore? And that's the real challenge that we're in right now, is that absence a governance framework that actually is present, like CUSP is developing, before a crisis emerges, you actually have no way on actually handling the data in a responsible manner, because it's done in an ad hoc manner driven by emergency. And that's the reason why we need to become much smarter about how to govern corporate data sets before, during, and after a crisis that occurs.
Great. Hi, thank you. My name is Alexander Custer. I'm from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I actually had almost the exact same question, but I want to dig a little deeper on one thing, and that would be to ask Professor Cohen how the fact that open data is driven by crisis so often, how that actually might change your applying the resource appropriation framework to looking at it. Does it make it perhaps even more dangerous?
Well, I think if you don't have what Stefaan just described, it does, right? Because there's the thing that you said about propositions is really key, right? We have this, I see it on my faculty all the time, like there's some issue and nobody knows what to do, and somebody says, can we get more information, right? It's like, we don't know what we're gonna get from the information. It's just this sort of temporizing strategy, and you see that performed, and more my concern, you see that sort of strategically exploited, right? You're blocking innovation, and so, you know, I do think that that this kind of governance framework is really key to solving that problem.
Hello, my name is Richard Dunks. I currently have a consulting company that works with city agencies, nonprofits, on open data, and was in the first CUSP cohort at NYU, and was involved in the data warehouse, or the data facility when it was a data warehouse. But my question is actually about, you talk about data governance models and things like that, and it is very important. I teach in the city, I work with city officials, people that are trying to learn open data, and one of the problems, I have never had anyone in my classes who has said, I have all of the data that I need whenever I need it. And this is people literally that will say, it's easier for me to go to the open data portal to get data from my agency than to go to that office, because it's of the data silos and the way it's structured. So I think there's an opportunity with what CUSP is doing to actually return value to the city in the sense of making their data even easier. There's initiatives in the city of New York, data bridge, things like that, but there's still some difficulty. So when we talk about building connections, I think it's important to remember it's not just a one-way street, government to citizens. It's actually about empowering governments at different levels, especially in the US. So I'd actually be really interested, particularly in Rebecca Rosen and Stefaan and the other panelists as well, but this idea of how with governance and with data building connections, not just in this one-way street, but back and forth, there's the opportunities to crowdsourcing data. DOT is now trying to engage the OpenStreetMaps community to improve bicycle lane data in New York City, and then they would re-ingest the data. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that, a governance model that's much more flexible, that incorporates this intergovernment and then also back and forth, the two-way street. Thank you.
So I can start. I think it's a myth that if you put researchers and city agencies together and let them share data, that they're going to both produce value for one another. And I think that's the role that a data facility plays, is to generate the valuable products back to the data provider so the researcher can go and do their work and do their research, and then pull in the research to inform the valuable products for the agencies. So the connections are not that simple. I feel like this third-party data facility is critical to facilitate those connections.
Right, and I mean, that's the reason why I hardly, I still talk about open data, of course, but I talk more and more about data collaborations, because that's really, the lessons learned from many of the case studies that we have is that impact of access to data really happens when there is a collaboration around a problem that was informed by the data that was made available. And so where you have the supply and the demand side coming together and then actually solving a problem with the use of the data in some kind of connective environment. Now, of course, we all know that collaboration in any kind of field of society doesn't happen automatically. And so the question is then, how do you actually facilitate collaboration in some kind of a coordinated manner? And that's the reason why intermediaries are becoming critical. And so CUSP is a clear example of a 21st century data intermediary where we see this happen, and especially the current version that Rebecca and Julia is working on really moves towards that direction. But you also have other intermediaries that we need to explore, and that needs to be more central in the data debates, including, for instance, libraries, which I've talked about in other occasions, where how do you actually create libraries, a new function of becoming a data intermediary, where you actually have, again, the demand and the supply meet, and then being facilitated in order to solve problems that can be solved in manners that are data-driven. So yeah, absolutely, collaboration and connections are key.
I just want to add that your framing actually is probably more accurate in the health context, right? Because in the health context, intermediaries such as IMS Health, their data cannot be used for real clinical research. Kim and I were just talking about this. But if you want clinical decision support systems, you're looking more at entities like Kaiser and Geisinger that actually provide the health directly and then get the data directly and carry out analysis directly on that data and are using it to create what we're calling the learning health system for personalized medicine. And so in the health system, I think that framework actually works quite well. But outside it, I think the points are well taken.
Well, one would hope it would work well.
Yeah.
I'm saying again, we should not, because having worked on healthcare for the last 10 years, I don't think we are there yet.
Yeah, I
right?
agree.
But there are lessons to be learned from clearly this notion of information exchange within the healthcare sector. I would say there are especially lessons learned on why it fails quite often, because actually you don't have this coordinating incentives that are present. But I would argue it's in any area of societal problems that you want to solve. You can actually advance the solving of the problem by thinking more in terms of how do you create data collaboratives around it, whether it's from education to criminal justice to healthcare and so on.
Yannis Tsiligakis, Henry George School of Social Science. One question is CUSP available to non-NYU people or institutions? And I also talk a lot, from your talk, you guys talk about collaboration, let's say, on a horizontal top level, like among, let's say, academic institutions, big corporations, government. However, I don't see any integration like on the, let's say, on the bottom of the pyramid, like citizen activists, like non-governmental groups. Right. How these actors can benefit from that. Right. That's one question. Second, is there an integrated database of data sets with not necessarily access to the data, but at least a description of the metadata of the data set, so people can see what data is out there, and then they can form research ideas or projects. And last but not least, it seems to me that the whole data production industry or enterprise is kind of like a Hollywood movie where the actors are basically taken out of the profit sharing. So the actors are the citizens who create, most of the time unknowingly, sometimes they're arm twisted into providing the data that creates the economic profit, but they are taken out of the dividends of the ensuing profit that may, or the values that are going to be created from that. Do you think it would be too radical to start thinking about engaging the data makers into the profit sharing?
Okay.
Thank you.
So I did mention that citizens are indeed part of our user community. It's just a little early in the game to start pulling them in. We do think they're valuable to engage, both in terms of using the data and validating the data. I don't know about the citizens actually lifting much of a finger in generating this data. Most of the data we're gathering from city agencies is administrative data that the city is already collecting. It's generated by citizen activity, but they're not actually filling out surveys or anything. Is CUSP open to the public? Yeah, I mean, it's an NYU resource. We have our data hub online. It's datahub.cusp.nyu.edu. We do require authentication into the facility to look at our data catalog to see what we have, and all of our green data is available. Our yellow data is only accessible through approved research projects. I imagine as we're in prototype beta mode right now. If everybody here gets a CUSP account and starts hitting our servers, we'll see what happens. But we are hoping to be able to manage public access to the information about what we are. Oh, and you asked about data integration, and it's actually a really good point. This has come up throughout the day, the value of linked data. We don't have an integrated database across all data sets, but we are looking to create important crosswalks between data sets for various research projects, and that is definitely part of the model.
Do you want to say something, Joe?
Yeah, so again, emphasizing the importance of collaboration. So that's where NGOs comes in as well. So the 19 case studies that we just finalized for Omidyar Network basically indicates where impact was highest is where actually the NGOs in certain countries stepped up and were part of the creation of the solution that came out of the data that was used, whether around better information for citizens about healthcare provision, whether it was better information about educational accountability. In each of those examples, you actually had NGOs working together with data scientists in order to come up with products that enable citizens to become smarter, and so that's a critical role that they play. Do we see more, or do we need more NGOs? Of course. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think the demand side of open data, which was mentioned this morning as well, is actually fairly undeveloped right now, and I think most of the attention is on the supply side. I think for the open data to really start creating value, we have to nurture the demand side much more to do that. Now, on your directory, there are plenty of directories. I would like to see an inventory of the data that is there and then matched with the data that is made open. And only then you will be actually, again, enable the demand side to actually start demanding more openness of the data sets that are not shared yet. So I think we need to have the inventory of all the data that is available, that is collected, and then match that with the data that is made available within cities at the level of countries, and then you will actually have a better sense about the scale of openness that we've achieved, which I think is still pretty limited.
Right. I just want to pick up on your last point about the dividends to the profit to the profit makers or whatever it is, and I think that as we've been talking today, there have been three visions of how the individual plays a role, right? I think the first role that I think everyone seems to be invested in is the individual as the consumer, right, of the information, et cetera. The second role is that of the individual as the raw material, which when you look at it is derived from that, and that I think that was Julie's point, if I read her correctly. And I think my point is that actually we should look at the individual as a citizen who should be involved. It's not happening now, but the individual should be involved in these processes, setting up the goals, setting up the methods, and have a voice. Because right now we talk about corporations sharing their data. Well, who is the them? It's the corporation, right? So sharing the data with the government, right? And it seems to be this paternalistic attitude towards the subjects who are then, towards the individuals who are then operated upon. And I think that part of the framing that has to happen is involving individuals as subjects again in the process, and we need alternate frames to do that.
Just to pile on, there's a great paper that just came out on SSRN. I've forgotten the name of the author. It's called FOIA Inc., and it's about the person actually went and studied like the number of FOIA requests that are just corporate requests into government. So it's your tax dollars that we're gathering this stuff to be released to become part of trade secret data sets. So it's really interesting and underscores that point.
But think if you had a model where the FOIA requests were also sent off to a third-party entity to live, as these are all of the data sets that had been FOIA'd by everyone, so then they become public domain as well.
Right, but it's just interesting because you can't if you rewrote FOIA to say, you can only give the data out for these purposes and not those purposes, it would never survive a constitutional challenge. So it's a puzzle.
So we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take the last two questions together, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
This panel has been very heavy on legal and economic rules. There's also a very strong social component. Protein chemists have lived for 50 years in a regime of, as soon as you publish a paper about a protein structure, you have to deposit it publicly in the protein data bank. Astrophysicists live in an ethic of, you get 2 years private use of your observations and then you have to make them available. High energy physicists never tell anybody anything. And this, despite the fact that the high energy and astrophysics data are commercially worthless and the protein data is potentially very valuable. So NSF and NIH are both struggling to push the ethic over towards openness. It's a very difficult shove. Anything that can be done when new data shows up to try to establish a public ethic rather than an entirely private ethic would probably be a good thing. I've asked a lot of people why the scientific areas are the way they are, and they say random decisions made 50 years ago.
Helen?
Yeah, this is a question for Julie. I understand that this part of your work is part of a bigger work, so this might be unfair, but in philosophy we would say one person's modus ponens is another person's reductio ad absurdum.
One person's what is another person's reductio?
One person's, inference to a conclusion is another one's, this is the conclusion, isn't it absolutely absurd? So, translating to a question to you, if I agree with everything that you say in your argument, what is the recommendation? Is the recommendation to say that we're allowing the property rights to jump on board too late in the process so that the guy with the spleen should have been able to, and individuals should be able to claim ownership so that down the food chain other people can't grab and enclose it? Or are you saying that no one should be able to, and we should not have any mechanisms in society for any collectors of information to establish ownership rights in that data?
Right. So I don't, a couple things. I don't 100% know the end of the project yet, but I don't think I'm saying either of those things. Making it our property isn't really going to do anything except lead to a bunch more disclosures that nobody reads and and waivers. So the best way to speak to your question is to answer it at a very high level of abstraction, right? And then you can decide if it's a reductio or you draw your own conclusions. But so there are a set of transformations going on in the way we think about legal entitlements, right, of which this is one, and it's part of sort of this shift to an informational economy. It's sort of there's an institutional accommodation to these new structures that are emerging. If you go back and look at sort of the trajectory of the industrial economy, you do see a progression over centuries, right, from, bring all the people from the farms into the cities, and if they get their arms chopped off by the factory machinery, too bad, and make them work 15 hours a day and send them to work at age 8, to a kind of more humane system, right? Imperfect, You see maximum working hours and minimum wages and age regulations, and you see OSHA, and you see all this stuff, right? So I think at a very high level of abstraction, my point is that what needs to be created, and you're not going to get there by saying our data is our property, is an information age, a set of information age institutions for protection of the interests of ordinary people, whatever forms those might take, right? So just a little more concrete speculation, people actually expect markets to be fair, right? You don't expect to go shop for like a computer and be shown a different price from your neighbor, or you don't expect your completely massively mediated information environment to just treat you completely differently from treat all three of us differently as transacting participants in markets, because actually, for all its warts, the market construct at the center of the capitalist political economy has a democratic aspect to it, and we are sort of letting people play fast and loose with that. And so one interesting thing that I think people need to do is think really creatively about how to kind of unwind that. But I don't actually know how yet. I hope I might. But Ryan has a good paper on this too, on privacy and markets, a love story. Go read it, it's good. So, that's what I think the general task is.
Well, we'll have to end on that note because we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
So I don't know if it came across at all, but what I was trying to suggest was this notion that
Yeah, I'm happy to. So on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, allow me to thank you for spending your Friday with us. It's been a long day. We have 15 minutes programmed for conclusions, but I think we might be able to do it in 1 or 2. It's really, sorry? You've got a long speech. I don't. It's been a real pleasure to watch the conversations unfold and to see the different panels speak to each other over the day has been a real treat. And so I'll just leave it at that and say I hope to be invited back to NYU again for many reasons. Thank you, Helen.
I'll say something very practical, because I think I've been hearing about like, oh, what about all these resources, and people of course have taken their own notes, but I think we'll start doing as good a job as Berkeley did in April of making all the resources of the conference available on the website, and we'll use like the email list of the participants and the speaker, like to send that resource around and to get it to everybody, so you can go home knowing that you'll have access to that. We have made recordings as well, so you can look back at some of the discussions at some point. So I'll leave it at that.
Although I won't sign the form, so that part won't be open.
Like this panel won't be open. Yeah, I also just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to Berkeley Center for Law and Technology for sort of making this happen in the first place with all these great projects that we could showcase at our event here at NYU. It's been a pleasure. And yes, I hope there'll be more times. I'll come to Berkeley next time. And to the moderators, the speakers, the note takers, to the members of the audience for just sort of being here and so many fabulous private conversations and excellent questions. Thank you to everybody, and I declare the end of this conference.